A very good morning to you all, and many thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the future of regulation across a range of sectors to help build trust in uncertain times. I'm Clive Myrie, and it's my pleasure to be your host today. Well, what a stunning last 18 months it's been. A once in 100 years catastrophe, the coronavirus pandemic has turned society upside down. And this, as a new generation of young activists and campaigners comes of age with forthright views on how society should function to tackle climate change, social inequality, and promote diversity. We're all settling into a life outside the European Union, and new technology and AI continues to shape our world, with data at the very heart of that revolution. This is a period of uncertainty and change, the like of which I've never seen after more than 30 years of frontline reporting from all over the world. So I'm delighted to be invited by the Solicitors Regulation Authority to chair today's event, looking at what such a period of uncertainty means. What are the opportunities as well as challenges, and how should regulators be responding? Now, it's fantastic to have such a wide range of delegates who've signed up for this event from so many different sectors: utilities, finance, aviation, telecoms, education, legal services, and many, many more at a time of complexity and uncertainty. Our focus today will be on how, across all sectors, we tackle the current and future challenges facing regulators and how we regulate. In particular, we'll be exploring themes such as competition, technology, diversity, and consumer protections. We'll be reflecting that range throughout the day with a diverse group of speakers across our 4 panel sessions, but we'd really like your point of view too, your input as well. We've already had some questions in advance, but you can also submit live questions by clicking on the question link below this video. If you could include your name, that would be great, but of course, you can also make a query anonymously if you feel that's the way you want to go. Now, you can also pop a question or comment on Twitter at #REG, futures, all one word. And this stream will be available on catch up, so feel free to share it with any of your colleagues. Now, unfortunately, the chair of the Solicitors Regulation Authority, Anna Bradley, can't join us today, so let me introduce Paul Phillip, Chief Executive of the SRA, to say a few words about today's event. Hi there, Paul.
Thank you, Clive, and good morning, everyone. As Clive said, I'm Paul Phillip. I'm the Chief Executive of the SRA, and it's an absolute pleasure, really, to welcome you all to our Regulatory Futures Conference this morning. As Clive has said, we live in very strange times. The last 20 months, I think, for all of society, never mind all regulators, has been difficult with COVID-19. And today perhaps is just a timely opportunity to consider some of the issues we may all face in what seems like a very uncertain time ahead. Our sector in the last 18 months has transformed how it does work. The courts, the law firms, and indeed the SRA itself has needed to reinvent how they operate in order to keep the ship afloat, as it were. And I know that we're not alone. I know that every sector of society, and probably all of you, have had very similar types of experiences and a shift to doing things very differently. The purpose of today, or at least one of the purposes of today, is to look very much at how we can future-proof what we do for the challenges, the uncertain challenges that lie ahead. And a key issue for regulation in every sector is getting the balance right for what is often described as the regulatory pendulum, as it swings to and fro from regulation, liberalisation, competition to really tight constraints and controls, usually in line with market development or indeed the political ethos of the day. So where should we be? Letting 1,000 flowers bloom, or tightly managing the markets in which we operate or the sectors within which we operate? Should the response to uncertainty be more focus on high-level principles and flexibility, or more lines in the sand? So we'll be talking a lot more about those in the first couple of sessions this morning, and later we'll be looking at technology and innovation, as we have all recently seen important responses to change are happening, but also it's important that regulators get to grips with what challenges and opportunities and indeed threats technology brings. So I'm hoping that we'll have a live discussion on that one. And we're also exploring in a later session diversity. What more can we all do to make a difference? Is it really just about setting the tone as a regulator, or can we be more interventionist and have a cause and effect in improving diversity in the sectors within which we work? With panelists from many different areas and some 250 people booked to join the conference this morning, I think it's fair to say that these are topical issues and that we're keen to learn from our shared pandemic experience. None of this, of course, is easy. So please do take the opportunity through the rest of the day to get involved in the event, to ask questions, as Clive says. And I'm very, very much looking forward to hearing from you and learning from you. So I hope you enjoy this morning. And back to you, Clive.
Thanks very much indeed, Paul. And to reiterate, yes, 250 delegates taking part. Again, this video and the sessions, they can be downloaded and seen later on. So many more people will join in watching what's happening today as well. But 250 is really, really good turnout. Now, let's get our first interactive session underway. Remember, this is your opportunity to raise the issues you want to discuss with our expert panels. Don't forget to click the Q&A link below this video. We'll be prioritizing questions focused on the themes of the panel discussion. And we'll try to get through as many questions as we can. And if we don't, your question will be passed through the chain to the SRA and to others. So you will get a response at some point. Later sessions today will cover whether regulation needs to be more flexible to cope with change and uncertainty, the role of the regulator in shifting the dial on diversity, as Paul pointed out, and the regulatory risks and opportunities that accompany technological growth. But first, we're going to focus on how, in ever-changing times, regulators can get the balance right between protecting the public but also encouraging competition and enabling the development of new and innovative approaches within the sectors they regulate. And naturally, we've got a brilliant panel to guide us through all this. Full biographies are available on the link below this video stream, but please welcome Neil Baton, Head of Partnerships at Trustpilot, Sarah Blackmore, Executive Director of Strategy, Policy and Engagement of the Social Work England, Polly Mackenzie, Chief Executive of Demos, and Paul Phillip, of course, Chief Executive of the SRA. It's great to see you all. Thank you for joining us for our panel. I want to begin by asking you all the same question in turn. And I want to ask you to give your initial thoughts on the scale of the challenge regulators may face, trying to balance encouraging competition and innovation and public protections. Polly, I'll start with you.
Thanks so much, Clive. And it's very tempting to give a one-word answer to a question of scale, which is it's really, really big. This is an extraordinary period. You've already mentioned the change we've been through over the course of this year, but actually we are living in what great writer, I recommend his book, Azeem Azhar, has called an exponential age. We've all learned what exponential looks like on a graph over the course of this period, but it's not just epidemics. It's all forms of change that are self-reinforcing, and therefore they speed up, they accelerate. And it's in the nature of regulators to struggle with that speed. It's in the nature of legislation to take years, especially on complex matters. Regulatory advice, it tends to follow markets and follow innovation. And the faster innovation goes, the faster regulators have to go. And that's challenging when it comes to understanding the technology, when it comes to recruiting the right kind of staff who can understand the technology. So that concept of an exponential age is vitally important as we think through how we do all forms of governance, but especially regulation of those complex, innovative industries. There's also a crucial feature of technology, which is not just complicated or complex, it's often incomprehensible to the human mind what is going on in algorithmic decision-making process or things driven by artificial intelligence. There was a lot of controversy last summer, about this time last year, around the A-level and GCSE results having been decided by an algorithm which was overwritten. But actually, it was a simple algorithm that a person like me with a maths A-level could understand. If you think about the Google search or the way that insurers are designing their insurance premiums, they're doing that by training machines to identify patterns And it's why you end up with all sorts of potentially discriminatory outcomes. You know, a machine learning program is identifying black faces less well than white faces, not because someone sat down and said, I'm a bit racist, I don't care about recognizing black faces, but because of the data, because of biases in the data that even the programmers don't really understand. And so the explicability of those algorithmic decision making is extremely difficult and almost impossible for regulators to intervene with. The developers themselves struggle with explicability. They have entire divisions around explicability. So keeping up with that at an intellectual and technological level is beyond difficult. And of course, a lot of what it exposes is, as I've mentioned, discriminatory in ways that are politically important for us to tackle. The questions around consumer vulnerability and discrimination are rising in salience because they're important. We have a much greater understanding of the impacts of mental health on consumer decision making. We have a much better understanding of the way structural and institutional racism or discrimination affect people. We know more about how disabilities and neurodiversity affect the complexity, again, of consumer decision making, of human interactions, and of how markets work. So there is so much to keep up with. That I take my hat off to regulators who are trying to do that. And it strikes me that, you know, whether it is cross-economy regulators like the Information Commissioner or individual market regulators like the Solicitors Regulation Authority, trying to think through how you keep up with an exponential age with political pressure is, you know, one of the greatest challenges of our time. And that's why I wanted to be here, really, to share thinking, because I certainly am at that stage of thinking, wow, this is just, as I started by saying, big.
Yeah. Sarah Blackmore, big and an enormous conundrum, encouraging competition, at the same time promoting public protections.
Absolutely, and coming at it from a slightly different angle, and more the kind of the innovation perspective. I think, like most of my colleagues in regulation, public protection has got to be our primary objective and responsibility. But I think it's probably the newest regulator here, with just over our first year live as the specialist regulator for social workers in England. We've had the benefit of new legislation which allows us to take a slightly different approach and to look in collaboration and to create the bandwidth to do things in a proportionate way in collaboration with those whom we regulate, and in particular those who have lived experience of social work services. The heart of this, I think, really is having robust professional standards in place that underpin your regulatory approach. And we developed our standards in collaboration with social workers and those with lived experience of social work, so that for the first time, our profession, which tends to get a bad rap in society, has a set of standards that were developed by the profession itself and by those with lived experience. And I think there's something very innovative and exciting about that. And this means that social workers in England can recognise themselves in the standards and can easily apply them to their day-to-day practice and have greater ownership of them, which has such a profound impact on millions of people's lives across this country every day. And additionally, when things go wrong, and as we know, they can all go wrong in regulated professions, and a social worker finds themselves in a fitness to practice process, we have the ability to work with those social workers to find an appropriate solution that may not mean having to go through to a final hearing with all of the expense, time and anxiety that causes. So if, for example, a social worker acknowledges that they've made a mistake, has taken steps to remediate that, whether through increased supervision, additional training, or whatever it might be, through our accepted disposal process, we can agree a more proportionate right touch response and or sanction. So while I think there's always a balance to be struck between being innovative and ensuring public protection, I think there are ways to find that balance. But I think as regulators, there is a continuing need to challenge ourselves to do so.
Sure. Turning to you, Neil, at Trustpilot, I mean, is it more problematic for you at sort of that end of the scale, not being a regulator, but knowing that obviously you've got to have public protections, but at the same time, innovation and technology are the kinds of things that will benefit the consumers that you represent?
Good morning, Clive. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, I agree. I think that this is the first regulatory body that we've been in touch with on a sort of a close basis, and the SRA have been very open in what they're trying to do, and they've understood that the actual, for the legal service profession, there is a lot of uncertainty around it. Lots of consumers might only use illegal services maybe once in their lifetime, maybe once every 10 years. So it's not something they're familiar with, and it always comes with a little bit of anxiety as well, because it might be a divorce or buying a house or whatever it might be. So what we found is the SRA actually being very open with what they're trying to do, trying to understand what Trustpilot can do with consumers. The voice of the consumer is very, very powerful. So, they, in answer to the original question, they've got a huge challenge, right, regulators, because especially more so with the legal firms, because, it's their profession to not necessarily get around regulation, but it's their understanding of regulation and legalese, if you like. So I think it's very difficult. And if you were to use the stick, I think that lots of the legal profession would be using this as a tick box exercise, whereas actually I think education rather than regulation is probably the thing that I would suggest, only because it's worked with other sectors that I've had an input in, whether that's automotive or insurance or what have you. What we've done is we've actually worked with the movers and shakers in those particular industries, and we've educated them about the benefits of listening to consumers. And then what I'm finding with the SRA is actually they're listening to us and asking for feedback from consumers, and then making decisions based upon regulation from what we're hearing from consumers. So I feel that, like I say, my only experience has been with SRA, but they've been very open, and I feel that listening to innovators and disruptors is really going to help curate their message to their members.
Yeah, sure thing. Paul Phillip, you, in your introduction, you talked about this regulatory pendulum swinging. And we are in a moment in time where our economy needs to go that way. It's gone that way for far too long, because primarily of the pandemic, and economies around the world are all facing the same problem. Is there the fear that the pendulum is going to swing too far away from regulation in order to allow businesses and certain sectors to really take off to get the economy going? Is the balance going to be cockeyed, for want of a better phrase, because of the situation we're living in?
It's a good question, Clive. I think this is, in that sense, in the context of the question that you've just asked, I don't think the pendulum swinging is anything new. It swings from left to right all the time. It's just that in the context of the last 20 months of what we've been through, the real question we have to ask ourselves as regulators is whether what has worked in the past, what has been appropriate in the past, what the framework has been in the past is actually the best thing for the future, given the priorities for the country. And as you rightly say, we've been through a massive public health issue, and now, as someone said to me the other day, the economic crisis begins, as a Rishi Sunak quote, I think, from a long time ago. But what happens in terms of trying to get the country back on its feet? What contribution can regulators who work in commercial markets actually make? And is it time to throw the regulator rulebook out and let 1,000 flowers bloom, as I said earlier, in the interest of the public, if that is in the interest of the public? Or what part can regulation play? And I think in many ways, regulation needs to think carefully about getting out of the way whilst maintaining consumer protection and protection of the wider public interest. And we'll all on this call, in our own organisations and sectors, have different manifestations of how one might do that. And we always live with the risk that actually we're too liberal, and therefore there's consumer harm, or there's harm to the wider public interest and to society, or indeed to the to reputations of trusted professionals, or that actually we stifle innovation, we stifle business, we stop the economic growth and hopefully return to some semblance of normality going forward. So the pendulum swinging is nothing new. I think we all have to think very hard in our own context about what that means for us, and we have to take risks, and sometimes the regulators have to lead and they have to get out of the way.
Okay, Polly, from your work at Demos, where's the public on this? Are they keen for lighter touch, market-driven regulation to drive quality and safeguard services? Or is there a preference for stronger regulators, or does it just depend on the sector?
In general, the public is in favour of regulation. They want there to be rules and they want them to be enforced. And, you know, those sort of liminal cases where things don't go right, you know, they upset people. And that's true across, you know, the food sector. The public sort of worry about whether their food is toxic, whether it's got horse meat in it, right through, you know, that lawyers should be doing what they say for the price that that they've said that they will charge. Across the board, you can expect that. But it should be a slightly more sophisticated conversation. So the classic model is to put the three things we're talking about today, protection, competition, and innovation, as a sort of trilemma. So trilemma, you put each one at the point of a triangle, and the regulator's job is to hold the middle, because if you have too much of two of them, you end up screwing over the other. So if you have too much consumer protection in a competitive market, you screw over competition. Equally, too much innovation and too much competition harms consumer protection. We have to remember, though, that the beneficiaries of great innovation and the beneficiaries of great competition are also the consumers. And so actually, regulation is about holding all of that innovation and competition together for consumer benefit. And consumers are also in favour of more cool stuff that they would like. And often innovation, whether that's innovation in insight to tackle those asymmetries information, like the insight that Neil is providing at Trustpilot so that you can make more informed consumer choices, or whether it's innovation of actual new products and services. You know, I'm surrounded by technology that didn't exist a decade ago, or whether it's innovation in practice, like, you know, social work practice, training and professional standards. All of that innovation benefits consumers in the end. And I think we need to have that conversation with consumers as well to hold them through the challenges that the innovation and change can sometimes create within markets.
Sure. Sarah, then, Polly touched on innovation and how that might affect the world of social work, training and standards. Just expound on that for us.
Yes, I think standards are, you know, really at the heart of regulation, and I think, you know, our primary focus has got to be to protect the public. So the primary function, I think, of regulators within that is to ensure that standards are upheld. But that doesn't mean that you must take it to the nth degree. I think there is a need, in when we're thinking about the pendulum, of looking at and exploring what we mean by right touch, light touch regulation, so that there is that balance that can be met between the public feeling that they are protected and that there are enough safeguards in place so that, you know, they are not ending up on the receiving end of really poor services that are going to potentially damage them. But at the same time, professionals feel confident in their regulatory bodies that they are not going to be overly penalised for at times where they might make a genuine mistake.
Okay, so Neil, are we then seeing consumers changing how services and products are provided? And are those changes improving quality?
I think consumers do. They are they're the voice. If they want things changing, the disruptors and innovators will make changes based upon what consumers want. So I remember the days where I used to go down the high street in the pouring rain and get to Blockbuster Video and pick out a video that had just been, like Polly has just taken out 2 minutes before, that I wanted. And what happened was that actually consumers didn't actually enjoy that experience, and actually by turning on their TV and renting a video in the walk for their own home, that's what they actually wanted. So I think these innovators, actually, they look at consumer feedback and understand actually that's not what people want, and we can look at technology and make a change. At Trustpilot, what we actually see with the reviews that we get is actually less about the product and more about the service. So we're actually finding a lot of the feedback is about post-purchase. It's about delivery, returns, refunds, and all this sort of stuff. Obviously, with legal services, which is what I can sort of potentially talk about today, it's a little bit different because the service is the product. But what we're actually finding is that it's less about the outcome. And I know this is going to be something that's might be a bit of a pain point for legal firms because they're all about the outcome. But actually, consumers, we're finding on Trustpilot, it's more about the service and how they made you feel rather than actually the outcome. It is still important, don't get me wrong. However, what we're finding is that I've done some research on all the reviews that are left for legal firms on Trustpilot, and communication was the number one topic discussed in 5-star reviews, and it was also the number one topic discussed in 1-star reviews. So in fact, actually, that is more important to consumers. So feeding that back to the regulators, feeding that back to legal firms to understand actually communication, customer service is vitally important. And if you get that right, you're going to have happy customers. That will improve their service, surely. And I think that if you understand, or if you can embrace that consumers are changing the way that they buy legal services, and it's now based upon other people's feedback about how you made them feel rather than just the outcome, and you can react to that, you will change your offering based upon that and win more business by improving your service quality. The other thing I wanted to say is with companies that adopt feedback methods, and Trustpilot's not the only one, by the way, by legal representatives, solicitors or whatever, knowing that they might well be left feedback, that might well improve the quality as well, that the service they offer.
We've got a couple of questions coming in here. This one is from Jonathan. Are there some sectors that are currently unregulated? For example, buy now, pay later, where you think regulation is needed? Paul?
Hi there. I think quite difficult one for me in the sense that I am up to my eyeballs in legal regulation and therefore probably don't know the other sectors. But the answer is probably, and that you take the framework we've talked about in this pendulum about public protection, about standards, about if you're a market regulator, about how competition is working, etc., and you apply it to that and you try and get the balance correct. And it really depends on the marketplace and what the risks are and what the purpose of your regulation are. And for those people who are on the call who are regulators, you will all have your own framework of what you're trying to achieve. Regulations here, as Polly says, people generally think it's a good thing with a pinch of salt, as long as it doesn't go too far. But actually, you've got to think about why you're here. Are you here to protect your users, your patients, your students, your clients, your consumers? Are you here for the wider public good, such as in our case, the fact that a competitive legal services market is in the wider public good, but it might not always be in the interest of consumers. So you've got to think about what the framework is before you would apply it to a particular area. But on the specific, I'm not sure I could identify areas where regulation is required, but the answer is probably, the question is, what kind of regulation?
Yeah, Polly, would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on buy now, pay later, I mean, the answer is yes, it should be regulated. What companies and innovators will do is, as Neil says, they'll look for consumer opportunities, but they'll also look for those gaps where they can create a new product that isn't quite this regulator and isn't quite that regulator, and then they sort of get through the middle as a result. And buy now, pay later is one of those things. It's not technically credit. We regulate credit, but because of the way it works, it has lots of the adverse impacts, and the FCA has. And I think the FCA has been really quite good on both innovation and consumer vulnerability with things like sandbox innovations and regulatory challenges or technical challenges to, again, build products and services for markets that might not attract that private equity or venture capital funding, like, for example, providing goods and services to help vulnerable consumers have better payment cards, for example, which might not be where the big money is looking for. But the regulators can do that too. They can drive through prizes and sandboxes innovation in the sector, in the sort of the segments that need it, and always be looking for those those little gaps that are missing. And that does mean you also have to then have conversations between regulators. The one that always annoys me is the Advertising Standards Authority, which is non-statutory, but still says that political advertising is not their thing. But the Electoral Commission says it's not their thing either. So you can basically say what you like on a political advert as long as it's not libelous. And that's a problem. It's a gap. There's loads of those gaps.
Yeah. Neil, did you want to come back in on that?
No, sorry, apologies. I thought they were regulated because they're typically these buy now, pay laters are banks essentially. So the one I'm familiar with is Klarna, it's a Swedish bank. So I suspect that they are regulated at some point. Interestingly, with the way that people you buy now, pay later is, it's a potential for getting consumers into debt, right? And what they used to do was payday loans. Now, consumers really reacted badly against payday loans. They used them, however, they had a really bad rap, and to the point where we don't really hear of many payday loan companies. I think the biggest one, they sort of went bust fairly soon after there's a bit of a backlash with all their consumers. So there is a consumers talking, and it is then tighter regulation, which then sort of squeezes these people out. And then another sort of like way of working, as in buy now, pay later, has come about, which seems to be a little bit more, consumer friendly. However, as I feel they're all banks, so they all are regulated by the FCA because they are offering credit at some level.
Sure. Okay. I mean, Sarah, I wonder how important it is for a regulator in making sure those they regulate are diverse and inclusive and representative of the societies they serve. And I wonder if that is particularly important with the work that you do.
Very much so. I mean, I think one of the things that has become increasingly clear as we've established our regulatory approach is that social work, as with society more broadly today, is not an equal profession. And I think the current global context in the aftermath of the horrendous death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement that has emerged has challenged many professions and many organisations. And social work and we as the regulator are no different and must act. And, as with everything that we do, our aim is to be sector leading in this and every other area. And I think we, like other organisations, have a lot to do both internally and collectively with our sector. I mean, we're hearing across social work at all stages how people are experiencing discrimination and disadvantage from, for example, the Black student who has no academic role model and whose class might receive an hour's teaching on anti-oppressive practice, to the Black male social worker who is more likely to experience disciplinary processes from his employer or to be referred to a formal fitness to practice process. We're hearing from social workers from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds that the same opportunities to progress are not open to them, be that promotion or access to leadership programs. LGBTQIA+ social workers who are discriminated against, their pronouns and identity ignored. And earlier in the year for International Day of People with Disabilities, we heard from those who have had to give up social work training courses due to inaccessibility, where they have seen allowances that would have helped them being given to other students, or who have not been able to take up placements or jobs for similar reasons. And all of this is before you consider issues of intersectionality. So we have a lot to do. And as the historian David Olusoga said, there are some uncomfortable truths that we need to hear and we need to be prepared to hear and act on. And the thing is, we know that we've all been here before. We've had this conversation before, and when the media attention drops off, all too often the conversation dries up. So I think this time it needs to be different, and there needs to be some real meaningful and tangible sustained change, so that, as social work continues to discuss its role in challenging the inequalities that people face, including each other, we will certainly be involved and actively be seeking conversations about that and talking about the role of regulation within that, both upholding safe and fair practice for the public alongside assessing our own work to promote fairness across regulatory functions.
Sure. Well, we are going to be in one of our later sessions discussing diversity and inclusion when it comes to regulation and different sectors. Paul, I just wonder if it's inevitable that regulation will always be behind the curve, as it were, playing catch up. A new problem has to raise its ugly head for something to be done, whatever the sector.
Yeah. Probably is the answer, particularly if you work in a market environment. Markets move quicker, as Polly says. People see opportunities, they move into those opportunities. And then after the event, you have to consider the pros and cons of the protections that the regulation is set up to deliver. You know, is there a sufficient consumer protection, or protection for patients, or protection for students, or whatever area you're actually working in? That's an inevitability. But regulation, as a bit of a theme for me this morning, it is about trying to get that subtle balance between not getting in the way of innovation and stifling innovation, because certainly at the SRA we have this, yes, we're here to protect consumers and end users, but we're also here to protect the wider public interest, and the wider public interest is things like the rule of law and the market working well. And if the market works well, then hopefully that would drive down prices, provide more availability of lawyers for people who need it most. And actually getting that balance right is really tricky. And I suppose the short answer is, I think probably we will always be behind the curve, but we need to get out of the way, and we need to make sure we don't stifle innovation by gold plating regulation. And I agree with everything Sarah said in relation to diversity, but and probably the core of regulators is the professional or ethical standards that they ask people to espouse to, but how that is embedded in the regulatory framework can stifle innovation from time to time. And I go back to the fact that things change, life change, values most certainly change, and actually what is acceptable 20 or 30 years ago might not be acceptable today, and therefore you have to be nimble, and you have to be listening to what the profession, and more importantly what the public is actually saying and thinking, and trying to double guess what tomorrow brings by way of regulation. So it's a hard gig, and perhaps we're always inevitably slightly behind the curve.
Yeah, Sarah, I saw you nodding along there. I mean, Polly, this is a question from Brian. I wonder if you can answer this. To what extent should regulators be using AI or data modeling, given what Paul's just said there, to predict and try to head off potential problems before they arise?
I think AI and data modeling certainly have a part to play in future planning, future proofing. We did a piece of work for the Information Commissioner's Office looking at the evolution of advertising and how that might play out in the political market, for example. Because it's hard for regulators, again, who at board level are often so focused on the extraordinary volume of work to get out of that headspace and think about the future. The AI data modeling, really, really important. I think there's also a gap, though, in terms of not just what regulators can do, but also what self-interest external research organizations can do, and not just us. But partly because we just don't have access to data. And it's really, when you think about discrimination and all those things Sarah's been talking so compellingly about, I've seen research from consumer organizations, for example, representing LGBT people. And the way they've tried to say that there's discrimination in the insurance market is they've done a survey of consumers who are LGBT and asked them if they think they're discriminated against. And they've said that, yes, they do think they're discriminated against. That's a rubbish methodology for trying to identify a problem. But it's because it's extremely difficult to actually understand what's going on, because all of that algorithmic decision making is proprietary information. So we need to think about how we can encourage and enable more data release, more clean rooms for data for academic researchers, and also when and where regulators need more rights, more powers to be able to pull data from those companies that they're regulating in order to model and understand. And again, different regulators have different powers when it comes to the commercially sensitive data they can pull. I think there's a real a need for more standardization, more leveling up, because of the complexity that technology is putting into these systems.
Neil, data is the byword for it comes to sort of Trustpilot and how it works. Would you agree with Polly's assertion there that we actually need more data release from companies?
Absolutely. I think, yeah, the more data, the better. But like you say, if it's a commercial company such as Trustpilot, we might not be. It might not be publicly available information. And the thing is, with Trustpilot being a data-driven company, it's all about data. We have to be very clear that data is not going to be shared with third parties because of regulations and things that Trustpilot has to stand by, and privacy and what have you. So yeah, very, very tough. I think that you're right. I think AI could be used to try and get above in front of the curve. However, it's very difficult to come by, especially from commercial organisations such as Trustpilot.
Yeah. This is a question from Kindness. Sectors like the property market can be subject to sudden or massive spikes in price. Can and should regulators do more to help prevent these situations? Neil, I'm going to throw that to you, actually. Fluctuations in the market. Should regulators be getting involved in trying to sort of squash wild fluctuations?
I'm not sure what they'd be able to do. I think some of these massive spikes in price is to do with this health issue that we've had. Obviously, people have we've had this huge pandemic going on now for 18 months, and that has had an impact on prices of houses, either up or down. So people have obviously decided that their life-work balance has changed, so they can now work from home, as we're all doing today, which means they don't need to go into that fancy office in London, and they can move a bit further out to get a bit more room or whatever. And you know what, regulators, there's no AI or data that's going to give them a heads up on that sort of thing. So I think very difficult to predict that.
Yeah, you used a lot of words there, basically, Neil, to say no. Polly just decided she's just going to say no.
She's much more succinct than me, Polly.
Explain yourself, Polly.
Well, look, I mean, there's so many problems with our housing market. It's essentially a Ponzi scheme. We have the smallest houses with the least private outdoor space. They're the worst insulated and the most expensive in Europe. So I'm up for trying to fix that. But actually, it's to do with money supply, financial services. It's to do with the way we ration land supply. And I think getting regulators to sort of go and tweak when you've got systemic structural issues, for me, that's a government approach. And unless and until, and I don't think it'll happen in my lifetime, we have a government that recognises that house price rises are essentially harmful because they're putting up the cost of an essential good and service for human beings, we won't be able to fix this problem. I love the idea that regulators could just sort of go in and say, oh, stop that, put the price down. It's not going to work that way. But one of the fascinating things to me in the property market is the way Grenfell has exposed a complete mindset failure around the regulation of fire safety, which was essentially outsourced to industry on the assumption that industry could just do it well. And it was a reminder that actually good regulation, even quite expensive processy regulation, is an essential feature of good markets.
Yeah. I mean, Sarah, how important is it, and particularly in your field, how important is it that information on regulated providers is easily available to everyone, and should publication of such information be a mandated requirement?
Yeah, I mean, I think data, to go back to points that my colleagues raised earlier, is a massive issue across regulation. I mean, certainly if you take equality, diversity and inclusion, for example, all of the things that I set out when I spoke a couple of minutes ago were things that we know anecdotally, but actually the data and the evidence base is largely lacking. And I think that's true of a number of areas of regulation. So there is a real need to look at a way to extrapolate the data that we need, or to convince members of the public and the people that we regulate to share that with us. And then that then brings in a lot of issues of trust and confidentiality, and how you assure people that you are going to be using their data for a good end, and that for a means that will actually lead to an increase in public protection, because you're approaching what you're doing from an evidence-based perspective, and also that you are able to better analyse some of the themes that are arising in society that are impacting on people every day. But I think we have a long way to go before we can bottom out this issue around data. So I'm not sure mandating it is the right answer. I think that then gets in the way of the issues of trust that I've just set out, but I do think it's an ongoing issue that regulators need to be across and need to be discussing with their registrants.
Yeah, do you agree with that, Polly?
I mean, basically, yes. Sarah's right. There you go. Trying to live by the succinct that I've just been describing. Never happened before in my life.
Indeed. Paul, this is for you, and I think given your role at the SRA, how important is it that regulators are actually independent of the service providers? And what does that mean in practice?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say, a personal belief is that regulators need to work with the sector and have, to some extent, the respect of the sector that they're working with. You need to understand the pros and cons of working in the sector. You need to understand what it's like to work as a solicitor in the vagaries of the particular market that you work within. So, what kind of pressures do housing solicitors face, or corporate solicitors, or that type of thing. You need to understand it, and then you need to think about how you can work with the profession in the interests of the public. So I would say that, first of all, because of course the short answer to the question is, from my point of view, is that there's a massive trust issue if the people who actually are part of the profession also end up regulating the profession, because people look at them and say, oh, well, it's an old boys club, it's, chaps regulating chaps, all that kind of stuff. But actually, you do need the views of solicitors in regulating the solicitor's profession. I would argue the same for pharmacists, doctors, teachers, whatever, because you need to understand the sector within which you're working. You need to understand the pressures that people are under. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, in order to get public trust, the regulation of the profession needs to be out with the hands of those who work within the profession, in my view.
Sure. Neil, here's one for you. This question has come in. Read customer reviews. Is there a danger around fake reviews distorting a market? And should regulators have an involvement in preventing these?
I think there's a real danger that fake reviews distort the market and make some businesses look better than they are. And it's a massive challenge. And regulators do work with us to prevent this. It's the number one challenge for Trustpilot. We stand behind the integrity of our platform, because that's only then it becomes valuable to consumers when they can trust the reviews that they read. I think with lots of these tech platforms, right? So I love Facebook, right? But can I go on Facebook and see someone beheaded? Yeah, it's absolutely awful. Well, can I go on Twitter and see some discriminatory information? Yeah, but Twitter's a great platform as well, and Trustpilot's a great platform. However, because it is so great, and because there's so much value in having a good reputation, some people want to cheat the system, and it's a shame, but that's unfortunately the society that we live in. But it's the number one challenge of Trustpilot, that we protect the integrity of our platform. But yeah, I totally agree that fake reviews can distort a market or a perception of a particular company.
So when it comes to Trustpilot, then it's a sort of two-step regulatory process. You're hoping that individual regulators for certain industries or sectors or whatever are doing their job, and then you've got to get in there and regulate too.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have to make sure that the reviews that are left on our platform are true, and we have an algorithm that picks up certain information. I won't go into all the details because people like to get around it, but it will look at IP addresses, it will look at language, location, all this sorts of stuff. But then we also have 50 people on the ground that are looking for indicators that a review is fake. We also feel that we're a community as well, and I think a lot of our reporting reviews comes from the community itself. So someone could look at a particular review and report that to say that doesn't quite look right, but that's not quite my opinion of that company. Would you mind looking into it? And that's when our 50 or so content integrity team will actually go out and it might be Polly that's left a review and say, hey Polly, you've left a review for XYZ solicitors. We actually really need to see some evidence that you've had a buying experience with XYZ solicitors, and that's what that content integrity team does. But we're always mindful that we can always do better, and it's a big challenge for us.
We've got a question here from some bloke called Paul Phillip. I think he's from the SRA. How does Trustpilot respond to complaints that the review is fake?
So, as I mentioned, so what we do is, if someone suggests that a review is fake, what we do is we reach out to that person that left a review, and ask them for some sort of evidence that they've had a buying experience with that company.
Right. Okay. Polly, you want to make a wider point about online harms and anonymity. Interestingly, that question about customer reviews, there was no name attached to it.
Yeah, I mean, we are going through this process this autumn with online harms, new rules, new powers for Ofcom, and of these things which are essentially harmful but legal content, and people trying to game review sites is just one of those things. Neil's also mentioned others, whether it is horrific, violence, or non-illegal kind of sexual content, and there is this movement to say that we just shouldn't have anonymity and everybody should be a sort of confirmed identity on the internet. And I think we need to be really cautious about that, because the danger is, actually, because once you're online, all of your activity can then be tracked and linked together. And the risks of creating that kind of enormous data pool about every individual person are extremely high, quite different from the offline world, where you can get away with doing most things without having to give your name or your papers. So again, this is just one of those other examples where there's like mega level thoughts about the nature of constitutional concepts like privacy and accountability and the rule of law that all regulators are having to struggle with. It's not as simple as there's this online harms thing and Ofcom's just going to sort that. Everybody has to get their mind around these complicated issues. And for me, I think actually the whole of our democracy needs to discuss them in more depth. It's not just, oh, Priti Patel will sort that out, don't need to worry about it.
Sarah, would you agree with that, particularly in your line of work?
Well, I think for me, it throws up the whole issue of the use of social media per se by regulated professionals, and how that fits with adherence to your professional standards. So we have seen examples in the social work profession of people with quite extreme views expressing those and feeling that it's okay to express those on social media, regardless of what the issue is. And that raises the question around, are you then able to demonstrate your continuing fitness to practice as a social worker because of what you might have shared? It also brings up the whole issue of like my colleagues have just been talking about, the appropriateness of anonymity and how we as regulators look at that alongside the robustness of our approach to regulation and regulation of how our registrants use social media. So it's far from a straightforward issue. It's something that as a new regulator, we are really grappling with. And I think it's something that we will need to have an ongoing conversation with our registrants, with our sector, and also with people who use social work services who all too often find themselves on the receiving end of really polarized views that might impact on their lives day to day and on the service that they receive. So there is a lot at stake in this debate, and there are no easy answers to it, but there is a real need to have that ongoing conversation and to provide a level of guidance that can be flexible and that doesn't get in the way of people's individual human rights, but that also will ensure that people understand that when they are a regulated professional, that they have an individual professional accountability that goes alongside of that, and that includes how they approach social media.
Sure, absolutely. We've got people tuning in from all over the place, and we've got a question here from Cord in Germany, and this is for you, Paul. Unmet legal need is a real problem in Germany, and we lack data to help understand the scale of this. To what extent is this a similar issue in England and Wales?
Good morning, Cord. I think I'm not aware of any broad empirical scale study that suggests that we can be specific about this. So we have done some research ourselves that shows that 9 out of 10 people who have a legal problem don't access the services of a lawyer. The Legal Services Board has done some research too, but the extent of the problem is probably non-specific. What we absolutely know is that there's vast amounts of social deprivation and social exclusion, and that goes hand in hand with people not being able to enforce, to understand the legal rights, to understand that their problem is actually a legal one, and therefore to begin to climb the mountain of how you might answer that and where you might go in order to get help with that type of problem. But I'm not aware of any specifics or any specific research that suggests the scale of it, but the scale is in no doubt, certainly in the UK, very, very significant indeed.
Sure. I just wonder, is there enough coordination between regulators to identify gaps or overlaps between their rules, or consistency in how common issues, the use of data, are addressed, Polly?
Well, so there's the UK Regulators Network, which brings lots of different regulators together to consider and discuss those issues. When I was running a charity called Money and Mental Health, which looked at, you're going to guess, money and mental health issues and the way they were linked, which of course affects, people's interactions with the internet and with broadcast services, affects people's internet with financial services and utilities. Actually, UKRN were a fantastic kind of convening force to enable a kind of a better way of looking at these things. Because when we at Demos have done work around consumer vulnerability in particular, I once wrote a report about people with cognitive deficits and their experience of fraud. And I had to write 6 pages on the different definitions of that word vulnerability by all the different stakeholders, because it was so complicated. And I think, so whether it's UKRN, there's also a new professional body for regulators, which I think is really going to help level up standards and dialogue. It's also about recognising there's so much more resource and more thought needs to be put into that shared learning practice and coordinated efforts. And it does come, sometimes, you do need to spend 6 months hammering out, like, what is it that we mean by vulnerability, and come to shared understandings of some of those questions. Because again, especially when it comes to trying to build AI models, your regulator's never going to get the same quality or experience, because they don't have the resources to chase, the people that Google are recruiting. So being able to coordinate activity is in my view, a really essential thing that regulators have the platforms to do. They just need to put a bit more resourcing into them.
Sure. Sarah, I wonder then how tricky it is for the regulator in social work, the police, dealing with the local authority, any overlaps, issues that there may be involved with multi-agencies being part of the process in dealing with social work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, social work is a profession that rarely practices in isolation, and tends to work very closely hand in hand with education professionals, with the police, as you've rightly said, with probation and a whole raft of others in the course of their day-to-day practice and activities. So, I think there is always scope to look at the regulation across that professional, that multidisciplinary professional landscape, and where there are areas of alignment and where there are areas where we might be getting in the way of one another, and also looking at best practice examples from international regulation, for example, which I'm not sure that we do consistently well in this country. I think that's one of the challenges for us as a new regulator, is to look at social work regulation internationally, to look at developing countries and how we support them too. But there is always, I think, a need for ongoing communication out with your own sphere of activity, and to continue to challenge yourself to learn and adapt, and take into account what others are doing really well.
Sure. Okay. I think I'm going to bring all this to a close. It's been absolutely fascinating, our first session, and thank you to everyone who submitted questions. Apologies if we couldn't get through all of them. Many thanks to our panelists as well for their insight, and we really want to hear what you thought of that session. Was it useful? What type of content would you like to see covered in the future? The evaluation link is below this broadcast. Click on it and let us know what you think. We'll also send it out on email a little bit later on for feedback. It really helps us improve future events. Now, we're going to be taking a short break, returning at around 10:50, when we'll discuss how we regulate in such uncertain and changing times, with an expert panel including members from Ofwat, the General Teaching Council for Scotland, and the Institute of Government. And at 11:45, we'll be joined by experts from the Office of Students and Black Solicitors Network to discuss the role regulators can play in shifting the dial when it comes to diversity and inclusion. And then at 12:40, we'll discuss the regulatory risks as well as opportunities linked to technology and Innovation, with an expert panel including members from the Financial Inclusion Centre, Information Commissioner's Office and Competitions and Markets Authority. Paula McKenzie, Paul Phillip, Sarah Blackmore and Neil Baton. Thank you very much indeed. And I'll see you all for the next session in a few minutes' time. Many thanks.
Ben has had